when you look at navigating high pressure sectors like healthcare, there is going to be toxicity that shows up on your team. If you're managing or leading, you may be making a huge mistake in this area as well that I made for years and years and years. And we're going to get to that at the end of this session today. But trust me, if you are making the same mistake that I made, you might actually be creating the very thing that you're trying to get rid of, or at least perpetuating it in ways that isn't serving you. Welcome to Safe Space Made Simple, a practical podcast that guides clinical leaders and healthcare managers to create trust and support with their teams. I'm your host, Trace Hobson. Join me for weekly interviews, practical tools, and inspiring transformational stories of bringing people together in healthcare. Now, let's dive in. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Safe Space Made Simple. In today's episode, we're going to explain how to use a safe space to let somebody go. Now, this is an important skill to learn, and we're going to cover it at a high level today. Now, if you're leading or managing, you know what I'm talking about. There are people that, for whatever reason, are unwilling to follow you. They're unwilling to work with the vision that you've got for your team. And when it comes to creating a psychologically healthy and safe space, or a neurobiologically safe space, they may not be somebody who wants to do that. Now, there are lots of reasons why that is that we'll talk a little bit about, but we're not going to get into the why that might be. What today's episode intends to do is to give you some very tactical and actionable things that you can do to manage this kind of a situation, but to manage it in a way that doesn't delay the inevitable, that doesn't create unnecessary pain, and that really does walk up to this situation powerfully in a way that's self-differentiated and not attached to what's going on across the table. So the first thing that we've got to get really clear on is a misconception that a lot of people have with a safe space. When we have a safe space, that means that we're going to have to just sort of put up with things that we don't want to put up with. And that's not true. In fact, I would say the opposite is true, that a psychologically healthy and safe space, a space where people can actually feel neurobiologically safe, is a space where we have to walk up to. It actually asks us to be even more conscious and aware and responsible for the kind of space we're creating with our presence, the way that we're showing up, and the effect that we have on each other at any given moment. I can't create a safe space for anybody else around me, but what I can do is generate it for myself and then invite others to do that work within themselves to also generate their own safety and take responsibility for that and self-leadership for that. So that's the first thing. Let's get that misconception out of the way. A safe space does not mean you play it safe. It actually asks you to be courageous, to be curious, and to walk up to the things within yourself that are activating you or gripping you or preventing you from stepping up and stepping out in ways that are challenging. And also, it asks you to address different behaviors in a team very directly and clearly with communication and conscious awareness. That also asks you to directly communicate with those around you, no matter what the situation, in a way that is incredibly clear, concise, and congruent with the values that you want to create as a leader on that team. This is really the seed of engagement that oftentimes we're looking for from our teams. I want people that are going to engage, but actually the leader needs to engage and plant those seeds in a very strategic and intentional way so that their team can also begin to engage in the parameters and in the boundaries that they create. Now, we're going to get into 3 steps that you can take as a manager or leader to deal with these kinds of situations. But before we do, we need to have a bit of context for the way that this is shaped in my mind and the way that might serve you as well. Now, context is important because you can do all of the things that you've got at your disposal in terms of performance management, any kind of, gradual training programs that you've got for leaders or managers or other team members that are not performing at the level that you'd like them to perform at. All of those things are fine. But if you don't have the right context in terms of the way that you're showing up, you're going to find this incredibly draining, like I did for so many years. And you're also going to find that you keep creating a default future that happens over and over and over again. So, what does that look like? Well, it looks like you having somebody on your team that is frustrating you consistently, that you're sort of just putting up with. You've tried all the things, you've done all the coaching conversations and the meetings and the different things that you've got at your disposal, and still this person is not able to access the kind of conscious awareness that you're hoping for, and it's having a toxic effect on you, on your team. And the other thing that is tricky about this is that person might be really competent in an area, and so you sort of just accept it the way it is, and then go year after year, month after month, and even in some cases decades with doing this over and over again. If you begin to contextualize this as your responsibility, and you take radical responsibility for the way that this occurs inside of you, it can begin to create an environment that will shift this slowly but surely. And there's a really good book that I love on this topic by Steve Zaffron and Dave Logan called The Three Laws of Performance. And I think I've listened to that book on audiobooks probably 10 times, because it's just one of those things that you can continually practice and hear over and over again to help you hone in. And they talk about the three laws of performance very specifically. The first law of performance is that your performance is always directly correlated with the way that people, places, and things occur for you. And so anytime you have somebody who is frustrating you and is what you would consider somewhat toxic or draining your energy, if you're not noticing the way that they're occurring for you and really paying attention to and working with what's inside of you around that, you're not taking radical responsibility for that. And what will end up happening is your performance will drop down based on the way that they occur for you. And so this is really a key to starting to understand what you can do that is empowered, so that you can have really powerful conversations. You can begin to speak in a way and show up in a way that is energized rather than drained. Now, the second law of performance that they talk about in the book is that our performance always shows up in the language that we use. And I agree wholeheartedly with this, because it's easy to say you're taking responsibility for something, but if you're taking radical responsibility for something, there's no complaints, there's no criticisms, and there's no condemnations, even internally, that you aren't aware of and noticing and taking responsibility for. So this is one of the things, the way things occur for you shows up in the language that you use, or even the thoughts that you use internally, because you probably learned enough to sanitize your language so that you're not saying some of the words inside your head outside your head. But really the tail of the tape and the litmus test is what those words are inside. So when you're dealing with that person that's frustrating or toxic on your team, and you're doing the same thing expecting different results, your level of performance and is always correlated with the way things occur for you or people occur for you. And then that leads into law number 2, which is that the way things occur for you is always connected to the language that you are using. So as you're listening to the language that you're using externally and also internally, that will start to reveal for you how this person is occurring for you, which leads into law number 3, which is that generative language creates a new future. Otherwise, if you're not aware of those 3 laws, if you're not aware of that radical responsibility that's going on internally, that is there in those complaints, criticisms, and condemnations, then what ends up happening is you're a part of this system that creates a default future over and over and over again, which is why this becomes super draining and also toxic. Now, there are specific self-coaching tools that you can use that will help you to work with what I'm talking about. But the real sort of basic input here is that the moment that you have awareness of what's going on inside of you, that's when it begins to change. So if you have an activation of some kind, some people call that a trigger. I don't really like that word trigger. It's more of an activator. It's an activation that happens. So you're dealing with somebody who's difficult to deal with, and you start to notice you're having a visceral physical response to that, an activation. Well, that is the beginning of noticing how this person is occurring for you. And When you start to notice that, and then you notice the language that you're using, and whether it's generating a new future or continuing to generate a default future, that's when you start to become aware in a way that can shift it for you. It's not even really about what that person outside of you is doing. It's more about the way that you're showing up with what it is that's going on for you. And on some level, in an unsaid way, we actually believe that we need to change things outside of us or a person outside of us in order to have what we want. And this is reflected in any time we blame somebody for something. Virginia Satir used to talk about this in her iceberg metaphor, that the blamer, the persona of the blamer, feels powerful in the moment, but they've actually just pointed at that. That was the gesture. She is pointing at that person over there, and that was actually giving away all their power, because what you're really saying is that I can't have relief until that person, place, or thing changes. And if you wait for that, I mean, I like, how long will that take? In fact, it might never change. So what do you do with this? So you can only lead within yourself, and when you take radical responsibility for what's going on inside of you, it can begin to shift. This is actually connected to the work that I do around systemic coaching, because the system that we're asked to work with in that space is not the other person at first. It really starts with us. It starts with the way that we work with what I'm talking about. It starts with the way that we work with how we feel in our gut, how we feel in our chest, how we feel in our head, and noticing that that is our responsibility, that nothing else, no one else is coming to take care of that for us. It's actually something that we need to take care of for ourselves. And we'll never take care of it by trying to get outside things outside of us to change so that we can finally be okay. Now, what I'm describing sounds simple and subtle, but it's very powerful, because when you slow down to the speed of your presence like this, and you start to notice what's going on inside of you, it energizes the actions you take after the fact very differently. So just think about this. If somebody's occurring for you as, frustrating and toxic, the tricky part is that might even be true. They might be that way, but if you're not taking responsibility for those labels and the way they occur for you, then what you're going to do is take actions from that sort of energy signature, and you're going to contribute to that in different ways that are going to cause more reaction, and it's going to be perpetual. It's going to perpetuate this to happen over and over again, and you're going to expect different things, keep doing the same things, expecting different things to happen, and that's going to drive you crazy. I know it used to drive me crazy, because it feels so like that stuck feeling inside that's happening is just, man, it feels awful. It just feels awful. And you feel really, really stuck. So it doesn't have to be that way, depending on, your skill and your competency in working with what I'm talking about. And this is definitely a skill that you can learn, that you can practice, and that does make a huge difference in the way that you navigate everything, including your leadership and difficult people that you're working with. Now, once you've got that context in place, there are 3 simple things that you can do that will help you to change this in a profound way. Number 1 is you've got to set clear boundaries. As I look back on my own experience with this, it's amazing to me that I didn't learn how to set a boundary in my executive leadership role until I was probably about 40 and I was in a role, and it was a simple boundary. I felt like every time anybody came to me to ask a question, I had to answer it right in the moment that I was in. And when I started to learn that that was not working for me, and it was actually causing added anxiety and reactiveness for me, I had to take responsibility for the way that that was occurring for me. And I had to slow down and notice, like, what is it that I really want and need here? And what I wanted and needed was to be able to say, take a breath, look at the person in front of me asking the question, and decide whether I could answer it in the here and now, or whether I needed a moment. And that led to a very simple boundary, which was to say, no, not now. At first, that felt so hard to do. But when I got to my office, the first couple of times I would do it, I would say, now, no, I can't answer that question right now. I need a few moments. and then I would retreat to my office and close the door. The sense of relief that I got from that was incredible because I was the person that had to have all the answers all the time. And of course, that's ridiculous. And I was exhausted and I couldn't actually do that. I don't care who you are or how great a performer you are or how much, money that you're creating in your business or how much results you're creating in healthcare. You can't do it all. And in fact, I learned, a little later on that my job wasn't actually to do those types of things anymore at all. It was to help the team to be who they are. So to set a boundary, there's a misconception that I had for a long time with this, that it was kind of a protective barrier that I would put up so that I would protect myself from people. Well, that's not true at all. It really is about going inside and understanding what you want and need to be able to function and be healthy and thrive. And you have to ask yourself the question, what do I want and need in this moment? And to slow down and put yourself at the top of your to-do list so that you can take care of yourself and be there for other people. I had to learn how to do that. That was so revolutionary for me to understand I'm not protecting myself from anybody. I'm actually telling people what my limits are. And I'm sharing with them what I can do and what I can't do. And that invited a whole developmental program for me to let go of this idea that I had to be on all the time. And, that felt so vulnerable at first, but it also was incredibly helpful because I started to understand where I needed boundaries in every area of my life and work with my daughters or with my partner or with my boss. I started to learn how to set boundaries that weren't about other people at all, but were all about me and what I could do and what I couldn't do and what I did want and what I didn't want, and saying yes and no. Rather than blaming people around me, I started to notice that when I took responsibility for it and then I would set boundaries around it, it was empowering. It was actually relieving, and I would feel an uptick in energy. So when you're working with somebody who's toxic or who is frustrating, even though I'm using those labels, as you've contextualized that by understanding that this is really about you, it's not even about them, then you can begin to understand what are your limits with this person, place, or situation. And then, of course, you've got to communicate them in very clear I language, what you need so that you can function. It's not about the other person anymore. And then you have to really detach from the way that lands for them. As long as you're communicating in a respectful, professional way that's about you and not about them, that's all you can do. Oftentimes people have expectations and they'll kind of have these ideas about what you should and shouldn't do. Well, that's awesome. And they're welcome to their perspectives. But at the end of the day, only you can decide. And so once you make those decisions and you really let go of having to have that person's approval for anything, then you can speak your truth, you can share your boundary, set your limit, and then let it be what it is for them. Let them have their own experience with that. Now, if they don't respect your boundary, then of course, that's a different conversation. And you're probably even going to communicate a clear consequence if they're not able to respect your boundary or help discover a new solution or a new boundary that will work for you. The second step is to enroll the person in what the vision is that you have for the team, what the vision is for their role and their responsibility on the team, and to begin to talk to them very clearly about what that entails. Now, you would think that everybody should always know what their role and responsibility is, but we come out of our lanes so much that it's really important for leaders to communicate and recommunicate and enroll people in what it is that they see as the vision for their role, how that might develop and evolve over time, as well as what the vision is for the team, so that they have a clear understanding of where you're going and why, and so that they have every opportunity to step into that flow and be a part of the team. Now, on another level, you can also enroll them in the possibilities that are available for them as an employee in their leadership development and taking responsibility for what's going on for them. If somebody's showing up in a way that's frustrating to the team or frustrating to you, it's really important to clearly communicate that and talk about that and discover together what might be there for each of you to take responsibility for. As you're the leader, but it's not just about dictating to anybody what they should do. It's about coming with a sense of humility and sharing, here's my part in this, here's what I'm up to, and then also enrolling that other person in stepping into their responsibility as well. You're on your side of the street and they're on their side of the street. And so enrolling them in their developmental conversation on their side of the street, I believe, is a really strong and good function for leadership in today's high pressure, high stress sectors, because we can look at high pressure, high stress as something that is sort of a negative thing, but it actually can be a hugely positive thing if we allow it to sort of refine us over time. And a leader who understands that can also invite their employees into that same kind of developmental game too. And the third step is to let go, be self-differentiated, and let go of the consequences that might be there if the person decides not to take responsibility for their part and continues to show up in a way that is not working for the team's culture or your vision. This is a really important one because it's subtle. We can come sometimes with our understandings and our hopes about what we hope for another person, but oftentimes people may not be ready for that. They may not want that, and that's totally fine. If you are unattached and you can let go of the results that you're hoping for with this person, then you can make new decisions that are not about them or you. They're about the stewardship of a team and a vision that you have. You have a role and a responsibility on your team as well. And so speaking to that makes it depersonalized. It's not really about you or about them. If you're on a clinical team of some kind in healthcare, you have a vision and a stewardship responsibility for the patient care in that clinical practice area that you're in. And so it's not even really about you or about them. It's about that. And as you cast that vision and you try to enroll them in it, oftentimes people may not want to step into the boat, and that's okay, right? Like nobody has to do anything. You can't make anybody do anything anyways. All you can do is invite and enroll. And you can also set boundaries around what you're willing to accept and what you're not willing to accept. And then you've got to let go of the results and let go of the person too. This might actually lead to letting go of somebody. And then with everything I've described in this explainer video, to actually now get to the point where you're moving into anything that is performance management and looking at offboarding somebody and managing them out of your team. Ultimately, everybody gets a choice about what they're going to do, where they're going to work. And that is true. I think that part of what's tough sometimes for leaders to understand is that as they're observing somebody making their choice with their feet and with the way that they show up, it's sometimes difficult to walk up to those behaviors and call them out, right? There's lots of reasons why that's hard, but what makes it even harder is not doing it. And if you're still with me at the end of this video, this is the mistake that I mentioned at the beginning that I made over and over again, and that I see a lot of leaders making as well. You can get this idea and vision for somebody, and you can have this hope for somebody, and they are just proving to you over and over again that they're not willing or they're not able to step into that function or into that role and to be that way on your team. And so they're really telling you very clearly what their vote is. Even though they're still on the team, they're actually saying, I'm not willing to do this. I'm not willing to do what it is that you want me to do. And I'm going to do everything in my power to not do those things. Well, I think that leaders have a responsibility to manage that person out of the team. Bottom line, and that might not be nice to say, but I think as long as on that journey, you can stay unattached in the process. I've seen people turn a corner and in the performance management journey decide that they're willing to step in and step up, and something shifts for them. As long as you hold that space, that intention that may happen or could happen, then I think that you're holding the tension of a both end. Listen, It's okay if you don't want to work on this team. It's okay if you don't want to do what we want to do, but we're going in this direction. And so I want to enroll you in coming along, but I don't need you to come along either. And it's okay if you don't want to. But one thing's for sure, the behavior X or Y, the way that you're showing up here or there is not working for me. It's not working for the team. And so, long term, you may want to consider not being on this team. Right now, that's a conversation that a lot of people are scared to have, especially if you've got a collective bargaining agreement and you've got a process. But you can stay within the confines of the CBA. You can stay within the confines of good, strong HR practice and still have very clear, concise conversations like that. And I think that probably the reason why people don't do it as much is because they're a little afraid, and also because they're still not self-differentiated in the process. And so that's why I started with the beginning and the context. So step number one, after you've set that context internally to be working with your own system, is to set boundaries. Step number two is to enroll people around you in the possibilities, in their highest and best good, and in their own development as a team member. And then step number three is to let go of the consequences that might be there should that person not do or not step up or step in to the vision that you have. That is totally fine. Now, the way that this is anchored in my opinion, in psychological health and safety and also neurobiological safety, is that at the beginning, when you start with you really are taking responsibility for the way that you generate a safe space from the inside out for you. And you start to understand that you may not be feeling safe, and that is your responsibility as a leader to start with yourself and to really set the tone and the foundation for what comes next. The other way that this is anchored in a safe space is that you're clearly communicating throughout the whole process. And I think that this is a very important facet of psychological health and safety and neurobiological safety, because you're speaking out what is in the space. How often have you been in a situation where you could tell that there was unsaid stuff? You could tell people were thinking one thing but saying another. That is so difficult to feel any level of safety around when you know that that's going on. When, as a leader, alternatively, the juxtaposition is to actually just speak it out and to be really clear with your communication. I think one of the places that I learned this in a really personal and poignant way was when I was being coached for a family member that I love, who was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, which is a combination of schizophrenia and also bipolar disorder. And one of the things that they coached me on really early on in my journey with that was that it was very important to communicate clearly what was going on to the person who was having that mental health challenge, so that they were really understanding what was happening in the space in between. She actually coached me to know that oftentimes when people have a mental health issue like that, they're highly attuned and sensitive to energy that's going on between people. And so if you're not saying things and not being open and honest with that person about your fears or concerns or thoughts, they pick it up and interpret it in ways that may not be accurate. And so this was a huge learning for me, with a family member that I love dearly. And I really wanted to have a relationship with that person that wasn't filled with all that noise. Well, I could see really quickly that that was something that was happening at work all the time, and two, that there was unspoken things, and that did not create the kind of environment that I wanted to be in. All right, that's a wrap for today's explainer video. I trust that you enjoyed this and that it served you. If it did serve you, could you take a moment and give the podcast or the YouTube channel a rating, a comment? If you could even leave a review, that would be incredibly helpful, because as we start to expand and amplify the stories and the different work that is being done to change healthcare today, it's helpful for people to see that this is actually serving people, and then they want to be a part of it too. So if you could take a moment and give a review to the podcast or a rating, and just leave that below or on any of the platforms that you listen on, that would be incredibly helpful. Thank you so much for listening. And again, remember to be a safe space. Thank you again for getting to the end of this podcast. And if you enjoyed this and you found that there was value in it for you, my invitation is for you to subscribe for future episodes that come out weekly on Tuesdays. Thank you again, and I'm looking forward to being with you next time. Now remember to be a safe space.